Some men are not broken by the world, but remade by its cruelty. They carry the ghosts of who they were into the harsh light of what they've become, and they find a fragile peace in the solitude that follows. This is the story of one such man, an outlaw rancher, and how he found a disabled 12-year-old Cheyenne girl, hung with a sign that read, "Kick me." Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wind was a sculptor on the high plains, carving away at the land until only the hardiest things remained. Gnarled juniper, stubborn rock, and Elias thorn. He rode with the ease of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. His face a roadmap of sun and sorrow. The world had branded him an outlaw, a title he neither fought nor embraced. It was simply a fact, like the grit of the dust between his teeth, or the constant low hum of regret that was the soundtrack to his days. He kept to the edges of the territory, his ranch a fortress of isolation built from bitterness and barbed wire. It was on the far edge of his own land, a place where his property bled into the indifferent wilderness, that he saw it, an aberration, a splash of color and wrongness against the muted brown of a lightning-scarred cottonwood. He reined in his horse, the animal sensing the shift in him, its ears twitching. It wasn't an animal caught in a snare. It was a child, a girl, tied to the tree with a length of rough rope, her arms pulled back at an awkward, painful angle. A crude cardboard sign was strung around her neck. Even from a distance, the 2 words scrawled in charcoal were a punch to the gut. "Kick me." He dismounted, his boots sinking into the dry earth, each step heavy. As he drew closer, he saw she was Cheyenne, her dark dress torn, her face smudged with dirt and tears. One of her legs was bent at an unnatural angle, held in a worn brace of leather and wood, and a fine tremor ran through her small hands. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the horizon, a place he knew all too well. It was the look of someone who had learned that meeting the eyes of your tormentor only invited more pain. He stood before her, a titan of weathered leather and dust, the silence stretching between them thick and suffocating. The wind whispered through the dry leaves of the cottonwood, a sound like a final, drawn-out sigh. Taking her in was not an option. It was a declaration of war on the quiet, fragile peace he had so carefully constructed. She was a problem that belonged to the town, to the fort, to anyone but him. He was a ghost, a man who had intentionally erased himself from the ledger of human affairs. To involve himself would be to draw a map for all his old demons, inviting them to his doorstep. He could cut her down and leave her, point her toward the distant smoke of the settlement and ride away. It would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing. It was the kind of decision the old Elias, the man before the fall, would have condemned. But the old Elias was dead and buried under a mountain of failure. He looked at the sign again. "Kick me." Such casual, artless cruelty. It wasn't the work of a hardened enemy. It was the work of cowards who found sport in the suffering of the weak. A flicker of something, a memory of a different child's face, pale and frightened, flashed behind his eyes. A ghost he could never outrun. He had failed to be there once before, and the cost had been absolute. The world had taken everything from him, and he had let it. He reached for the knife at his belt. The girl flinched, a small, almost imperceptible tightening of her frame, a bracing for the final, expected blow. He didn't speak. Words were useless things, clumsy and hollow. Instead, he reached behind her, his movements slow, deliberate, and severed the rope with a single, clean slice. The tension gave way, and she slumped forward, a dead weight of exhaustion and fear. He caught her before she hit the ground, her small, frail body a shocking testament to her ordeal. The burden was so much heavier than he'd imagined. His ranch was not a home. It was a wound that had scabbed over. The cabin was sparse, functional, every object within it holding a purpose and nothing more. There was his bedroll, a table with one chair, a stone fireplace, and shelves holding the barest of necessities. It was a place built for one man's solitude, and now it held 2. He laid the girl on his own bedroll, the only soft place in the entire structure. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency, fetching a basin of water and a clean rag. He cleaned the raw, chafed skin on her wrists, where the rope had bitten deep. Her eyes followed his every move, wide and dark, reflecting the flickering firelight. She was a wild thing, a cornered animal waiting for the trap to spring. He understood her silence. It was a shield, the same one he had used for years. He worked without a word, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were calloused and scarred from years of hard labor and harder fights. He examined the brace on her leg, noting its simple but sturdy construction. Someone, somewhere, had cared enough to make it for her. Where were they now? He set a tin cup of water and a piece of dried jerky beside the bedroll and retreated to the far side of the small cabin, giving her space. He took the cardboard sign, the two hateful words staring up at him, and tossed it into the fire. It curled, blackened, and vanished into smoke, but the sentiment lingered in the air, a foul stench he couldn't erase. He sat in the single wooden chair, watching the flames, feeling the familiar weight of the world pressing in on him. The four walls of his cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, and he had just willingly locked the door from the inside. He was no longer just an outlaw. He was a guardian, and he had no idea if he was saving her from the world or just damning them both. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. The silence in the cabin remained, a living entity that grew and shifted between them. It was a tense, fragile truce. Elias went about his chores, his movements economical and practiced, always aware of the small shadow watching him from the doorway of the cabin. She was a ghost in his periphery, silent and observant. He never tried to force her to speak, never asked the questions that burned in his mind. Who was she? Where did she come from? Who had tied her to that tree? The questions were doors he was not yet willing to open for fear of what lay behind them. He spent an afternoon working with a skittish colt in the corral, a half-wild creature the other ranchers had given up on. He didn't use force or a whip. He used patience, a low voice, and a stillness that seemed to calm the animal's frantic energy. He spoke to the horse more than he had spoken in the last year, his words soft murmurs of reassurance. He did not know the girl was watching from the fence, her small hands clutching the rough wood, her gaze intent. She saw not the fearsome outlaw the town whispered about, but a man who understood the language of the broken and the frightened. Later that evening, as he cleaned his saddle leather by the fire, he noticed a change. His worn work shirt, which he'd left slung over the back of the chair, had a tear in the sleeve. He had meant to mend it for a week. Now, he saw the tear was gone, replaced by a line of small, neat stitches, the thread a slightly different color from the rest. He ran his thumb over the repair. It was a tiny, almost insignificant gesture, but it was the first crack in the wall of silence. She had claimed a small piece of this space, mended a small piece of his world. It was an offering, a wordless message that said, "I am here." The simple act of domesticity felt profoundly foreign, a memory from a different life. It did not comfort him. It terrified him. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the coffee was gone. The unavoidable had arrived. He had to go to town. The thought soured in his gut like bad milk. The town of redemption was ironically named. It was a place that offered anything but. It was a town that remembered everything and forgave nothing. He looked at the girl who sat by the cold hearth, tracing patterns in the ash with a stick. He could leave her, lock the door, ride in, and be back by nightfall. It would be safer for her, away from the prying, judgmental eyes of the townsfolk. But the image of the cottonwood tree, of the rope and the sign was burned into his mind. He couldn't leave her alone. The risk of what he might find upon his return was greater than the risk of taking her with him. He grunted, a sound that was his version of a command. "Come." She looked up, her eyes questioning, a flicker of fear in their depths. He simply nodded toward the door. The ride to town was tense, the silence between them heavier than ever. As they rode down the main street, a river of mud and refuse, the world stopped. Conversations died. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. He felt their stares like physical blows. They saw what they wanted to see, the outlaw Elias Thorne, with a savage child in tow. It confirmed every dark rumor, every whispered story they told about him. He dismounted in front of the general store, the girl shrinking behind him as he tied the reins. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cinnamon, leather, and open hostility. The storekeeper, a man whose piety was as starched as his collar, barely acknowledged him. As Elias gathered his supplies, Sheriff Miller walked in, his presence filling the doorway. Miller was a man who enforced the law when it was convenient, his badge a symbol of the town's selective morality. "Thorne," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at Elias, but at the girl cowering behind his legs. "What's this?" Elias's voice was low, a dangerous rumble. "Supplies." "I ain't talking about the flour," the sheriff said, his gaze hard. "Where'd you get her?" "Found her," Elias replied, the word clipped. "She belonged to the reservation?" Miller pressed, his tone dripping with condescension. Elias stared back, his eyes like chips of flint. He didn't answer. He simply placed the coins on the counter, grabbed his sack, and turned to leave. He put a hand on the girl's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. He was drawing a line in the sand, and he knew the whole town was watching. The sheriff's cold eyes and the town's silent condemnation followed him all the way back to the ranch. The confrontation, as brief and bloodless as it was, had scraped open a deep wound. As he unsaddled his horse, the scent of the pines and the clean, cold air did nothing to calm the storm inside him. The girl had retreated back into her shell, the fragile trust of the past few days shattered by the encounter. He watched her limp toward the cabin, a small, solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. And suddenly, he was no longer on his ranch in the high territory. He was back there, in another dusty town, on another terrible day. The memory, always lurking at the edges of his consciousness, rushed in and consumed him. The smell of smoke, the shouting, the shattering of glass. He had been a different man then. A husband, a father. He had owned a small printing press, his weapon of choice the written word. He had dared to print the truth about the powerful cattle baron who was squeezing the life out of the local homesteaders, using hired thugs and corrupt lawmen to steal their land. He thought words were enough. He thought the law would protect him. He was a fool. They came at night, not for him at first. They set fire to his press, his life's work. When he ran out to fight them, they went for his home. He remembered his wife Sarah screaming his name. He remembered the face of his own daughter, Lily, just 7 years old, her eyes wide with a terror he had brought upon her. He fought, but he was one man against 6. They beat him senseless and left him in the dirt to watch his world burn. By the time he dragged his broken body into the smoldering ruins of his house, they were gone. Sarah and Lily, gone. Not dead, the sheriff had told him later with a smug satisfaction. Just taken. He never saw them again. That was how Elias Thorne, the newspaper man, had died. And Elias Thorne, the outlaw, was born. He found himself standing in the middle of the yard, his fists clenched, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, the colors of a fresh bruise. The past was a relentless phantom, and today it had a face. He walked into the cabin. The girl was by the fire, her knees drawn to her chest. She looked up as he entered, her expression wary. The fear he saw in her eyes was a mirror of the fear he had seen on his own daughter's face, and the shame of it was a physical blow. He had failed Lily. He could not fail this child too. He crossed the room and knelt before her, the movement awkward and stiff for him. The firelight danced across her features, illuminating the fine line of her jaw, the dark pools of her eyes. For the first time he spoke to her not out of necessity, but out of a deep, aching need to connect, to bridge the silent canyon between them. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse, softer than he intended. She stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. She seemed to struggle as if the words themselves were stones in her throat. He waited, his patience absolute. She opened her mouth, but only a small, frustrated sound escaped. Then she looked down at her hands. With a trembling finger, she traced a shape in the dirt floor. A bird. A small, simple drawing of a bird with its wings outstretched. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. He looked at the bird, then back at her small, resilient form. A sparrow. Small, common, but a survivor. "Little sparrow," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek, but she did not look away. For the first time, she did not look away. In that moment, she ceased to be a symbol of his failure or a burden he had to carry. She was Little Sparrow, And he, for the first time in a very long time, felt like more than just a ghost. The fragile peace was short-lived. A line had been drawn in the town of redemption, and Elias had chosen his side. He had chosen the girl. A few days later, he found the well rope cut. The next morning, a section of his fence was torn down, the wires snipped with a contemptuous ease. These were not random acts. They were messages, probing attacks from the cowards who had tied little Sparrow to the tree. He knew who they were, the spoiled sons of the town's most influential men, boys who had never faced a consequence for their cruelty. They saw his protection of the girl as an affront, a challenge to their unwritten authority to torment whomever they pleased. They thought him a broken-down old outlaw, an easy target. They were about to learn how he'd earned his reputation. He found them one evening, 3 of them, riding along the ridge that overlooked his cabin. They weren't hiding. They were making a show of it, their laughter carrying on the wind, arrogant and ugly. He didn't ride out to meet them. He waited. He watched from the shadows of the pines, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. When they were close enough, he stepped out, a silent, menacing figure materializing from the twilight. Their laughter died in their throats. "This is private land," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a gravestone. The leader, a burly young man named Jed, son of the cattle baron who had ruined Elias years ago, smirked. "Just admiring the view, Thorn. We heard you took in a stray." Elias didn't rise to the bait. His gaze was flat and cold. "The view is over. Ride out." "Or what?" Jed challenged, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. "Or you'll learn the difference between a girl tied to a tree and a man who knows where to bury a body," Elias said. There was no anger in his voice, only a chilling certainty. The other 2 boys shifted nervously in their saddles, their bravado evaporating under his unblinking stare. They saw it then. Not the quiet rancher, but the ghost of a man with nothing left to lose. Jed held his gaze for a long moment, then spat on the ground and wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over," he snarled over his shoulder. Elias watched them retreat, his body rigid. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The attack came 3 nights later, under the cold, indifferent light of a full moon. They didn't come with taunts this time. They came with fire. A burning torch arced through the night and landed on the dry roof of the barn. Flames erupted, a hungry orange beast consuming the structure that had taken him years to build. Elias was out of the cabin in an instant, shotgun in hand. Little Sparrow, a frightened shadow in the doorway behind him. There were 5 of them, their faces illuminated by the inferno they had created. Jed and his friends, and this time they had the sheriff with them. Miller wasn't there to stop them. He was there to sanction it, his presence a silent approval. "Thorn," Miller yelled, "you're harboring a runaway. The tribe wants her back. Come out peaceably." It was a lie, a flimsy excuse to justify their violence. Elias knew it. They knew it. He fired a blast from the shotgun into the air, a warning shot that echoed across the valley. "Get off my land!" he roared, his voice raw with fury. This was the same fire, the same smoke, the same injustice from years ago. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just defending a memory. He was defending a life. They charged, a chaotic mess of rage and entitlement. The fight was a brutal, desperate ballet of violence. Elias moved with a terrifying efficiency, a cornered bear fighting for its territory. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and years past his prime, but he fought with the strength of a man who had already died once. He took a blow to the head, the world spinning. As one of the men lunged at him, a sudden piercing cry cut through the chaos. It was little Sparrow. She had darted from the cabin, clutching a heavy iron skillet from the hearth. She didn't scream or run. With a strength born of terror and desperation, she swung the skillet with all her might, connecting with the back of the man's knees. He buckled with a cry of pain. His attack on Elias thwarted. The momentary distraction was all Elias needed. He rose, a bloody and battered avenger, and the fight turned. It was no longer a rout. It was a desperate struggle for survival. He drove them back, not with skill, but with pure, unadulterated will. They retreated, dragging their wounded, their arrogance shattered, leaving behind only the crackling ruins of the barn and the heavy silence of the night. In the aftermath, the world was quiet except for the hiss and pop of the dying fire. The moon cast long skeletal shadows across the yard, illuminating the wreckage of the fight and the smoldering skeleton of the barn. Elias stood in the center of it all, his body a symphony of pain. His head throbbed, a cut above his eye dripped blood down his face, and his knuckles were raw and split. He leaned on the shotgun like a crutch, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He had won, but it felt like another loss. Another piece of his world turned to ash. He saw little Sparrow huddled by the cabin wall, her small frame trembling. The heavy skillet lay on the ground beside her. She had saved him. This small, broken child had faced down her own terror to protect him. He walked over to her, each step in agony. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the protest of his bruised ribs. He reached out, not to her, but to the skillet on the ground. He picked it up, its weight familiar in his hand. Then he looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, something new. A flicker of fierce pride, a spark of defiance. He didn't have the words to thank her, to tell her what her bravery meant. Words had always failed him when it mattered most. So he simply offered her a ghost of a smile, a slight upward turn of his lips that was more a grimace of pain than an expression of joy. But she understood. She reached out a small, trembling hand and for the first time touched his face, her fingers gently tracing the cut above his eye. The silence that settled between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was a shared understanding, a bond forged in fire and fear. The town was still out there. The prejudice and the hate had not vanished. But as the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, casting a soft, hopeful glow on the devastation, Elias knew they were no longer two separate, broken people. They were a strange, wounded family, and together they would face the morning.